I'd like to invite Karen Rosenberg now to the stand. No. Is it not Karen? Sorry. Oh, sorry, Rachel. Oh my God, my mistake. Rachel, I'm running ahead of myself. Rachel Caspari to the stand, who's going to be talking to us about missing the wood for the trees, race, Neanderthals, and the significance of population relationships among archaic populations of the genus Homo, which I'm very looking forward to. Thank you. Where's Rachel? Trying to find her. She's getting set up at the back, so she'll be out in a moment. So just some background whilst we're waiting. So Rachel is Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Central Michigan University. She mainly focuses on the Upper Pleistocene and demographic changes in human evolution, and is particularly interested in the role of changes in population structure and life history in the middle upper Paleolithic transition and the origin of modern humans. A lot of our work is linked to the issue of changes in adult survivorship and life expectancy, and how these contributed to population.
Hello.
Welcome, Rachel.
Hi. What a nice introduction. Thanks, and a long one, too. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Clive and Jerry and the entire organizing committee, and it's just been wonderful to be here last time, 3 years ago, where we had such great discussions, and I'm really hoping that similar discussions come out of this meeting, and I'm sure they will. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, but also the same in some am I echoing? This sounds okay? A little bit different in that I'm going to bring some social issues into this. And right now in my career, I'm revisiting things that I did about 20 years ago. Is this, yeah. Okay. Okay. Technology has never been my friend, ever. So, I'm revisiting issues of race largely because of politics. That right now in the United States, there is a sort of resurgence of racial ideas, and it's extending into science. And right now in the New York Times, you can read articles that validate ideas about race using scientific data. And what it is it's a misinterpretation of scientific data, but it's widely held by the public. So anthropologists in the United States have been quite good at basically convincing people that biological races didn't exist. But now you see this resurgence of articles coming up saying basically that race does exist. And what they're really saying is that geographic variation exists. And the big problem that I think we have as scientists is we have to really make people understand that geographic variation and race are two totally different things. And so I'm sort of moving in that direction, and there is a prehistoric component to this because racial thinking implies separate histories of different racial groups, and prehistory then is a part of that. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about that. Is there a clicker? Now, of course, I'll screw this one up, too. Okay. Right? No? Haha. So this is a reconstruction. This is not a Neanderthal. And Neanderthals, of course, play a huge role in this because of the perceptions of Neanderthals over time. This is a reconstruction of an Upper Paleolithic youth from Russia. It's the Gerasimov reconstruction. I think it was done by Gerasimov. And this is an Upper Paleolithic European. And if you take a look at him, you will see that his features do not look particularly European, right? They look African, or they could potentially look Australian. And that's because our ideas of the primitive, when we think about the primitive, we often think about depicting fossil humans, whether they're Upper Paleolithic humans, and especially Neanderthals, as non-European groups, and we've done that historically. This is a Neanderthal this is from the Neanderthal diorama at the Field Museum from years ago. But you see these things constantly. They're depicted as being stupid, they're depicted as being non-European, and that is people's idea of what primitive humans looked like, or early archaic humans. And I just put this little chart up here, which I don't know if you can see. This is one by Ernst Haeckel, where he was speculating who the, I feel like there's a huge, yeah. Further down, yeah. Yeah. Like that? Okay. Yeah. Maybe I'll just use that. Is that okay? Is it still echoey? I'm going to just use this. That's easier. Right. I prefer walking around, but this is. It's weird to hear yourself talk and echo at the same time. It's not fun. So, what you will notice. This is not a good start. Okay. Taking this off. Thank you. Okay, start again. So we have these primitive depictions of archaic humans, that are basically using the non-European as primitive. You have this early phylogeny of Ernst Haeckel's that has these hypothesized ancestors of Homo sapiens, with Pithecanthropus alaeus that turned into Pithecanthropus erectus, and Homo stupidus, who is clearly there in the place of Neanderthals. So we have this idea of the primitive being stupid and association of the primitive with in a sense, with the association of the primitive with different racial groups. Also, what comes into this is the idea in these racial classifications of prehistory is that morphology in some way denotes intelligence or behavior. And this is just an early depiction of the evolution of the chin, where you go from basically apes to Neandertals to Australians and Africans and Europeans, which is supposed to be basically an entire chain of intelligence, in effect, that's also reflecting an evolutionary change. And so you have this relationship between morphology and behavior as well. You also have allusions of the justification or the explanations of colonial practices. So here you have this is a quote from the Quennells in 1945, where you have, with his large head and thick frontal bones, he must have been very good for butting a brother Neanderthal, but it was no use against the stone wall of advancing civilization, great technology there. And like the Tasmanian and the Bushman and the Red Indian Australian of nowadays, he fades out of the picture and his place is taken by a cleverer people. And you see depictions, this same sort of thing depicted in all of these reconstructions of Neanderthals being replaced by modern humans. You have Neanderthals looking very non-European in this particular sense, right? Using primitive technology, being replaced by people that look like modern Europeans with far more advanced technology. And this is often used to naturalize the social order. And so you have the use of prehistory, in a sense, to naturalize a social order that was founded on colonialism in this particular case. And we wrote a lot about this about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, in a book called Race and Human Evolution. And what I'd really like this talk to focus on is one other aspect that we discuss in terms of the relationship between race and human evolution, which is that our thinking about race informs our thinking about human geographic variation today. And that has implications for the way we view people in the past. And I think one of the problems with all of this new discussion about race existing is this conflation of race with human variation, and that has to do with racial thinking in society, and it also has to do with the idea that race can be thought of as trees. Because that really is what race is all about. It's not geographic variation. It's, in a sense, a hypothesis about how geographic variation forms. And it's the idea of isolation, which is then depicted as trees. So I'd like to talk a bit about trees
and then come back to race. We've used trees for a very long time in Western culture. These are some examples of the ways that trees have been used long before evolutionary thinking about trees. You have the tree of life, for instance. An example on the far left, an example of the tree of life from the 12th century. Tree of virtues, you can think of these things as trees, also from the 12th century. You have genealogical trees, which we see a lot of, right? We all love our family trees, right? And then there's Haeckel's tree of life, which we'll come back to, because Haeckel's trees had some very negative social implications in the 20th century. So I'd like to talk a little bit about family trees and some of the problems with trees. Okay, this is an example of a family tree. This is from the Habsburg, the Spanish Habsburgs, stemming from Charles II, also called the Accursed. Not exactly one. It's Charles the Accursed, and you'll notice that there's a huge amount of inbreeding in these family trees, and that there's inevitably going to be a lot of inbreeding in these family trees. If you actually look at this, it's still drawn as a tree. It still looks like a tree, but if you actually convert this into a chart, whoops. Technology, why is this happening? There, if you convert it into a chart, you basically have something that looks far more like a trellis than a tree, if you actually look at these relationships. And you see that a lot when you think about whenever you see these charts of royal families, you always see all of this inbreeding that goes on, right? They're very inbred. And that clearly cannot be restricted to royalty. If you just think about the power of twos, right? Without significant inbreeding, we would each have 1 billion ancestors 30 generations ago, right? Because, every generation you double your ancestry. So we all have had to have lots of inbreeding. So I decided I would take a look at my own family just to see, because now you can Google everything, how much inbreeding is there in my family, which I never thought of as a particularly inbred family. I did happen to know that my father's mother's parents were first cousins. So I knew that happened on that side of the family. I thought, that's very aberrant. So I went to the other side of the family, my mother's side of the family, which is an American family. And so there's a lot of information in it in Google. You just Google and you find all this information. It's kind of amazing. So this is some of the stuff I found out about my own family that I had no idea about until this conference. So I have you all to think about this. Thanks for this. So this is my grandmother's father. His name was John Charles Folger. He was born in 1857. Folger is the name of coffee people, no relation to them. Guess what? His father's name was Jethro Starbuck Folger. Who knew, right? So, wow, I thought that was surprising, right? Jethro Starbuck Folger. And it turns out that Jethro Starbuck Folger married someone in the Starbuck family. I don't know how to use a pointer here, but Jethro and his wife here has a Starbuck mother. So Jethro married Rebecca, and Rebecca's mother and Jethro's mother are first cousins, with the relationship being through these Starbucks. And then, if you go even back further, which you can also do on Google, you find that Judith Starbuck and Paul Starbuck, brother and sister, had Dorcas Worth and Edward Starbuck as parents, and Joseph Worth and Dorcas Worth are also related. And so all of these things, they're inbred. There's lots of inbreeding. If you just look in your own family histories, you're going to see all these sort of cousin relationships. Here's another ancestor of mine on another side of the family. Found a picture of him. His name was Jonas Votaw. And this is another one of my great-grandparents, Emma. And her father was Jonas Votaw, and his two parents, John Votaw and Rebecca Burson, are my great-great-great-grandparents, going back 5 generations. Okay? if there were no inbreeding, and I don't believe this to be true, I'm sure there was inbreeding, I just haven't found it there yet. If there was no inbreeding, they would be, each of those folks, each of the 32 people that would exist then would contribute 3% of my ancestry, which we'll come back to when we think about what it means to be 3% Neanderthal, for instance. It certainly doesn't mean that, right? But it's an interesting sort of thing to consider. Another thing, and of course, there was no doubt significant amount of inbreeding, and I probably didn't really have 32 sets, 32 individual grandparents, because I'm sure there was inbreeding, but I just don't know the details of it, but say there weren't. Another thing to consider here is that John and Rebecca Votaw, I know a lot about this from Google, had lots of kids. They had about 9 or 10 kids. Their children had quite a few kids. And I can estimate, just back of the envelope writing, how many fourth cousins I share, just because we have John and Rebecca as great-great-great-grandparents. And it's between 2,000 and 3,000. Between 2,000 and 3,000 people are my fourth cousins just from that one relationship. Now, if I drew my family tree, and they all drew their family trees, there would be huge amounts of overlap. And then you think about all of the other people that who you share ancestry with. And what you really have are all of these trellises that totally overlap. And this was looked at. So you basically have these trellises and a lot of shared ancestry. Ubiquitous shared ancestry, maybe. And in 2013, Ralph and Coop wrote this interesting paper in looking at the geography of recent genetic ancestry across Europe. And what they did with each of those people that I share ancestry with, 4 or 5 generations back, there are going to be blocks of genome that I share with them that are identical by descent, that are the same because we share those common ancestors. And what Ralph and Coop basically did was they looked at a large reference sample, and they looked at sections of genome between pairs of individuals that were identical by descent. They looked at the number and length of those segments to determine the relationship and common ancestry of populations in Europe. This original publication was focused on Europe, and what they found was very recent common ancestry. So the little graph under B basically shows on the top each one of those little, the little colored things are basically the range of probability of where ancestors came from geographically. So these are 2 geographically distant individuals from different populations in Europe. And after 12 generations, it shows the number of common ancestors that they would share. And after 16 generations, all those little black things with the overlap are the number of generations that they would share, the number of shared ancestors that they would have after 16 generations. And what they say is that we have shown that typical pairs of individuals drawn across Europe have a good chance of sharing long stretches of identity by descent, even when they are separated by thousands of kilometers. We can furthermore conclude that pairs of individuals across Europe are reasonably likely to share common genetic ancestors within the last 1,000 years, and certain to share many within the last 2,500 years. And they later write that you can expand that to the entire human population, so that what they're basically saying is not that you share an ancestor, but that all of your ancestors are the same at a particular time. So it's not one common ancestor, it's that you share the same suite of common ancestors. And they argue that as recently as 4,500 years ago, everybody on Earth shares the same set of ancestors. So what that would mean is that everybody 4,500 years ago who has descendants living today is the ancestor of everybody alive on Earth today. That's pretty wild, right? And in my opinion, that is refutation of race, because you're not looking at distinct ancestors, you're looking at amazing amounts of interbreeding that that lead to a very, very messy tree indeed. It doesn't lead to this idea of the delineation of people in different kinds of groups having separate histories. And in fact, some people have thought, this is of course Darwin's tree of life from his notebooks, some folks have argued that actually even if you're looking at the origin of life, trees get very, very messy with lots and lots of genes getting interspersed. And of course, John talked a bit about this too, that there's lots and lots of connections between trees. And maybe there's actually a lot of connections between trees, leading to a major question of when do we use trees and when don't we? Trees versus networks. Now, the thing is that tree thinking is absolutely critical to race concepts. And what I want to do is run you through this historically and explain why, historically, trees and races basically go hand in hand. And so if you can disprove trees for living human populations, you've basically refuted the race concept, and that's what people, I think, really need to understand. So many people, one of the questions that people are arguing about is, does race exist? And then what, of course, is race? Because it means so many different things to so many different people. And of course, race is a taxonomy, right? It's a way of classifying people. It's a social taxonomy, and we have social races for sure, and it is the way society classifies people, and people classify themselves within society. One of the big questions is it a biological taxonomy? Can we think of populations of people or geographic groups of people as taxonomic parts of humanity? And the problem is that the Western race concept conflates both of those things, because social races, these social classifications, are believed to connote biological differences, and it biologizes society, and that's a real problem. This is just an example that we know that race is a cultural construct. This is Papa Doc de Valier, the famous dictator of Haiti. And you may know this apocryphal story about him, that he was talking to an American journalist back in the early 1960s. That's actually Nelson Rockefeller with him, showing his great support for the dictatorship of Haiti. But anyway, in this particular, this American reporter was talking to Papa Doc de Valier, and he mentioned that 80 or 90% of the population of Haiti was black, and this came up in conversation, and Papa Doc took great offense to that. And he said, that's not true. He said 80 or 90% of the population of Haiti is white. So they went back and forth on this for a little while, and then the Papa Doc finally said, well, how do you define black? And he said, well, basically, anybody with African ancestry would be considered black in Haiti, and that's how I consider what the reporter said. And he said, well, that's funny. Said Papa Doc, that's how we define white. Anyone with any European ancestry would be considered white. And so that's who's right. So it's a cultural construct in this particular case, and it's basically, in this particular case, race is taking a part of your ancestry, perhaps, and it doesn't have to be actual real part of your ancestry, and it's emphasizing that to the exclusion of other parts of your ancestry for social reasons. I often use this picture in my classes just to see what students say, and I ask them to tell me where they think this is taken, and most of them think it's a scene in New York and that these are African Americans, and it's actually a scene from Papua New Guinea, and people are using actually these typological features that they think would classify these folks as African. In fact, they aren't. But it's showing the cultural construct of race in the United States, that all of my students think that these are African people. So the Western race concept informs our ideas about race, and it is loosely connected to geographic variation and the notion of biological race. And it's shared in many parts of the world because of that shared history of slavery and colonialism. And so the Western race concept isn't just constrained to the West, and it's actually bought into by many people. I'm always struck by looking at Native American origin stories now, which tie in Western race concepts into the Native American origin stories that certainly weren't there before contact, but they have as a part of their story how the yellow race and the red race and the white race all originated, and that's clearly a part of Western contact. So the Western race concept, I think this is more than we're going to talk about here, but I think all people in a sense have race concepts. They have very typological ways of thinking about self and other. But in terms of the Western race concept that informs us and informs our thinking about the past in prehistory's terms, it was conceptualized within the natural history tradition, which is important to think about, largely by Linnaeus, and then for anthropologists, it was emphasized a lot by this guy Blumenbach, right? And Linnaeus, as you may know, codified, right, the essence of these Western racial categories in Systemae Naturae, in the 10th edition of it. And in it, this is the huge book, right, where he writes, where he has descriptions of all the plants and animals that basically people were finding, that Europeans were finding during the Age of Discovery. And he defines subspecies of humans in that 10th edition in 1758. And for instance, these are the kinds of descriptions that he had, right? That Homo sapiens asiaticus was yellow, melancholy, and greedy, hair black, eyes dark, severe, haughty, desirous. And then they had some clothes in here, so that and this is sort of how you would define the subspecies. Loose garments and ruled by opinion. Americanus for Native Americans, red and ill-tempered, hair black and straight, nostrils wide, face harsh, beard scanty, obstinate, paints himself with red lines, ruled by custom. And of course you have your Homo sapiens europus. White, serious and strong, hair blonde, flowing, eyes blue, active, very smart, inventive, covered by tight clothing, ruled by laws. And last but not least but definitely least, was Homo sapiens affair, who was black and impassive and lazy, and this is the only subspecies of humans where he actually refers to genitalia. I mean, it's both sexist and very racist, right? And all of these classifications they reflect ideas of the time, right? Linnaeus had never met anyone from Africa, But his classification reflects two major aspects of the race concept. One is that it's essentialist, it's typological, that you really believe that there is an essence of these categories and that he is defining that essence. And biological determinism is a part of it. The idea that there are cultural traits that are a part of that classification. And those are two aspects of race. There is a third aspect of race, especially because it was informed in the natural history tradition. And that is, how did it happen? How did these racial differences come to be? How do you explain that these different groups had these different essences? And originally, before 1859, right, generally people thought about it in terms of biblical creation. And the classic way of thinking of it was a monogenist way, where there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and after the flood, the sons of Noah dispersed into different parts of the world, and they were the ancestors of these different racial groups. And usually the terminology was that they degenerated from the perfect stock in the Garden of Eden. And that was basically the monogenous tradition. It had isolation at its core, because they went off in their different ways, and since then, they degenerated and were separated from the other groups. There were also polygenic traditions that were far more severe, and they argued that there were basically separate creations of Europeans and non-European groups. And early on, before the turn of the 19th century, even in the middle of the 1600s, there were polygenic ideas that were basically, that involved pre-Adamites, that there were people before Adam that God had been practicing with, and that these guys were around, and that's there had to be someone around for Mrs. Cain, and so there was some practicing before the actual origin, and they hung around a bit, and that's where you got the other races of the world. And then in the 1790s, people started to articulate this as God actually creating, at the time of Adam, different races in different places that were well adapted to those regions. And that form of polygenism, actually, it was a major debate in early anthropology, but that form of polygenism was pretty much refuted by Darwin. And what took its place was what I've termed an evolutionary polygenism, where people actually thought of races as branches on different evolutionary trees. And they thought that their differences actually were due to evolutionary mechanisms that involved isolation. This is Ernst Haeckel, and he argued that the lower races are nearer to the mammals, apes and dogs, than to the civilized European. He was a great disciple of Darwin, and of course he's a very famous biologist who brings us such great concepts as embryology, phylogeny, ecology, and all sorts of things, right? And so the lower races are nearer to mammals than to civilized Europeans. And what's very frightening here is that he says we must therefore assign totally different value to their life. And he was also a great artist, as many of you may know. His artwork was actually wonderful. And he depicted different racial groups in very much the same way as he depicted different species of other primates. And he really did think of races as species, as separate branches on these evolutionary trees. And we come back to his tree of life, and you can see that he has a nice branching tree of life with all of and it's branching with the implication that there's no connections between the branches. And for many cases, with higher taxa, that's absolutely much more valid than within humans, right? Then if you look at the little lines under mention, you see that he's got basically 5 big branches there that are under at the very, very top of the tree. At least he sees them as, he sees humans as monophyletic. But then he has these very separate branches up at the top of the tree, which denotes isolation. And then many smaller groups within those branches are also depicted that way. So populations, not just big geographic races, are also depicted as branches on a tree, with the idea that this kind of isolation is valuable. He was a great believer in the importance of interracial competition, and he believed that's why, even though everybody was separated, that many of us evolved in the same way. So he thought we all got big brains because we were all competing with one another, and therefore brains expanded, that type of a thing. So racial understandings of human evolution and human variation were typological, polygenic to a large extent, right, that they were very separate, and that human differences, and often the value of those differences, were attributed to separate and usually unequal evolutionary trajectories and histories. Evolutionary mechanisms could explain the difference and could explain how those differences came to be. And this is Arthur Keith, who is a famous ancestor of ours in our field, right? Who wrote in this particular case, and this is from 1936, which you need to keep in mind, right? 36 is not a good time to be writing this. It says, as in the past, the future of each race lies latent in its genetic constitution in the past. The separated branches of the human family appear to have been unfolding a program of latent qualities inherited from a common ancestor from an earlier period. He argued, like Haeckel, who he thought was great, was that human evolution is carried out by group contending with group. Groups are kept apart and isolated by their mutual antagonisms or aversions, and isolation is a condition that must be preserved if a group is to evolve. And interracial competition was an important part of this particular form of social Darwinism, which actually played a huge role in the development of Nazi biopolicy. Who wins interracial competition, right? This is, again, from Haeckel. The immense superiority which the white races won over other races in the struggle for existence is due to natural selection. That superiority will, without doubt, become more and more marked in the future, so that still fewer races of many will be able as time advances to contend with the white and struggle for existence. And this had important social implications, and that's what I want to bring back to folks, right? Who wins? And who loses? And what does the primitive look like? In the early mid-20th century, people started putting fossils on these trees. And this is the stuff that many of us remember from when we were students, right? People thought about how do we understand the origin of modern humans? Was it a recent origin? Was it an ancient origin? And how do the fossils fit on those trees? And this is a graph from W.W. Howells that shows different racial groups and the origin of those racial groups through with fossils that had been found at the time put onto those branches, and you can see that there. There were lots of other trees that weren't monophyletic. There were lots of polygenic schemes that involved, for instance, Klotch had one where you had an Australian common ancestor, 2 branches off from that, and an Asian branch and a European African branch, and the Australian humans were the common ancestor of Asian apes and Asian humans on the one hand, and African apes and African humans on the other. I mean, there were wild schemes. I mean, just unbelievable, right? For American anthropologists, this person's really important. This is Ernest Hooton, who is basically the father of American anthropology, of physical anthropology. And his polygenism extended back to the Miocene, so that he argued that certain progressive Dryopithecus genera took to the ground in several parts of the anthropoid zone. Some of these were the progenitors of the lines leading to the present-day races of man. So we're looking at long separations, people basically becoming human separately. And these are 2 of his most important students. Sherry Washburn on the left, who absolutely demolished the idea of racial anthropology, and Carlton Kuhn on the right, who carried it well into the mid-20th century. Carlton Kuhn was a scary guy. You know, he took this sort of a model, right? And he argued that different races had different evolutionary histories, and different races crossed the Homo sapiens threshold at different times. And those that crossed the sapiens threshold first were better than those who crossed it later. And Europeans and Asians crossed it first, and Africans and Australians crossed it last, and that explained differences in cultural achievement in his mind. Now, this is all well and good, and we can say this had no influence, but it did have influence, just like Haeckel had huge influence. Carlton Kuhn's cousin wrote a book called Race and Reason, a Yankee view, that became required reading in the Louisiana public schools, that was sent out to members of the Senate in the United States at just the time when people were arguing about school integration. And there were big battles to keep schools segregated. And this was used as propaganda in the anti-integration campaigns. And Putnam said, when the president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, which Kuhn was, he was very well. He was from Harvard, he taught at Penn, and he was the chair at Penn for a while. He was a very well-established guy. Magna cum laude, graduate of Harvard and a native of New England, states that recent discoveries indicate that the Negro is 200,000 years behind the white race in the ladder of evolution. This ends the integration argument. So what we say and how it gets interpreted can make social differences. And this is why I think it's so important for us to be thinking about this at this time. Now come back to trees. That tree that I showed a second ago actually is supposed to be a simplification of this. This is Weidenreich's network. Franz Weidenreich was a 20th century biological anthropologist from Germany who's best known probably for his great monographs on the Peking fossils. And he was a fantastic anatomist, who came into the field late. And he developed a model of human evolution that multi-regional evolution is fundamentally based on. And from the 1940s, this was what he published, right? And he shows the relationship of humans, of different human groups, which are listed across the top, and sort of stages of development, which actually comes from Mount Carmel things, and then different fossils that were known then on this tree, on this chart. And what you can see is that it is not a tree. And he did not think racially. He didn't think about human variation as being linear. He thought of it as being branching, and he thought about what we would now call gene flow as being a critical part of it. He certainly didn't mean that all of these were equal, and he certainly didn't mean that all of these were equal at all times, that sometimes vertical changes were more important than horizontal ones, but he basically thought that this was the pattern of human evolution. This was depicted, he had no students, and his model was depicted as this tree. And it's absolutely the antithesis of what he was thinking about. Is the antithesis of what he was thinking about. And this was a guy named W.W. Howells who wrote this up, and late in his life, we talked to him about this, and he actually said, and it was at a meeting, he said, well, you know, I didn't really mean to misrepresent his views. He said, I really thought I was simplifying it. I really thought I was simplifying it. I didn't really think that I was misrepresenting anything. And he did misrepresent it a lot. This is from one of his later books called Getting Here. And what he basically argued, and this is what I remember learning in the 1970s, basically, there's two models of human origin, of modern human origin. There's the candelabra model and the Noah's Ark model, right? And that one was that there was continuity over long periods of time, and the second was that there was this replacement model. And so he thought, really, that that was what the two competing ideas were. That one was a tree that had long roots, and one was a tree that had short roots. But in fact, that wasn't the issue at all. The issue was, do you have a tree or do you have a network? And what I think is so interesting about that is that it's the subconscious way that we think about human variation, which I think is tied to the essentialism that it's at the core of the race concept. He wasn't doing anything on purpose. That's how his thinking worked. So that if you're talking about populations with time depth, you've got to be talking about raza, a line. The word race comes from the word raza, from the old Italian raza, and it means lineage. So he didn't see, because of this primacy of, I think, racial thinking, he did not see the difference between these models. He thought that one was a representation of the other. He basically thought that human variation meant race. And it comes back to this. It comes back to people like Nicholas Wade, people like more recent people writing in the New York Times, that race exists because scientists have shown that there's genetic differences between populations. We know that. We can see that there's differences between populations. That doesn't mean that race exists. And race has all sorts of baggage that goes with it about separation between groups. So race does not equal geographic variation. It's basically a hypothesis about the cause of geographic variation. It doesn't mean that those kinds of isolating mechanisms couldn't exist, but we shouldn't assume that they do. For contemporary people living today, I think isolation is refuted for modern humans and their immediate ancestors for all the reasons that we talked about when we talked about trees, right? That there's ubiquitous shared ancestry and inbreeding, there's overlapping trellises, likely a shared set of common ancestors only 4,500 years ago, which is pretty amazing. But what about archaic humans? And this is largely what John was talking about to some extent. And it's a very, very hard thing to think about when we think about archaic humans. How do we apply this to our understanding about Neanderthals? And I just want to talk a little bit about this guy, Joseph Chang, from Yale University. He's a statistician. And his work, which has nothing to do with genes, has nothing to do with what we do really, but he got very interested in it when people started publishing the mitochondrial data. And they were looking at these haploid genomes. And he said, well, let's just look at some simple statistical models of what happens if you look at two-parent genealogies and when you share those common ancestors. And he was just modeling. And he had a very, very simple model, one that doesn't have any kind of basis. Really, he had very unrealistic assumptions about panmixia and random mating and all sorts of things that don't really apply, but he just wanted to see what would happen, right? And what he found was that there was a logarithmic relationship, that basically you could look at shared ancestry as the relationship, as a log relationship because of the power of twos, a log relationship between population number and there was a logarithmic and the number of generations back in time, if that's making sense. So what he found is that about 1.77 log n generations, and n is the size of the human population, right, before present, all partial ancestry ends. That's where you don't have just one common ancestor, you have all common ancestors. And for a large n, as humans are today, right, all individuals who have any descendants among present-day individuals are actually ancestors of all present-day individuals. And it was his paper, actually, that Ralph and Coop were interested in looking at with genetic data. Actually, he was very interested in this model. He never thought, this is basically a thought experiment. And if you do what this is it's remarkably short. The log n, 1.77 log n generations, this would be at base 2 generations, if you have 5 billion people, say, would only be a few hundred years ago, where everybody would share that common ancestor. We know that isn't true, right? We know that that can't be true, and it's because of the assumptions are violated. And of course, this doesn't really apply because of the unrealistic assumptions of the model. Random mating, no population structure, random draws of potential parents, and all sorts of things. But it was a great thought experiment. And what was so amazing is that the Ralph and Coop study with genetics actually confirmed it. It was, of course, further back in time than would have been suggested, but it really did confirm this recent common ancestry. So is this something that could be applied to fossils, to archaic populations? All of those assumptions, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about. It's a thought experiment. Of course, I think it's, for many of the reasons that John just said, right? It's more unrealistic for archaic groups, even though log n is much smaller because they have much smaller population size. So you would think that coalescent, the time when they all shared the same common ancestor, would be much, much more recent. In fact, because the populations are probably so subdivided and small, it would probably be even more unrealistic, and probably they would have a very deeper coalescence. But it's something to think about, right? Given the high mortality that we know archaic populations had, and this is a chart that Adam Van Arsdale did on work that Sang-Hee Lee and I published a long time ago on mortality in archaic groups, where we showed that basically these are mortality curves based on different old-young ratios in the fossil record. That for Neandertals, which is in the green stripe, there's basically 4 old Neanderthals in the fossil record for every 10 young Neanderthals in the young adult Neanderthals in the fossil record. So their OI ratio would be 0.4. For the blue line, which is for Upper Paleolithic Europeans, the OI ratio is about 2, which means that for every 10 young adults, there's 20 older adults, a big, big change in demography. But for those archaic populations, they had very, very high mortality. What that means, basically, is that these populations would have to be more ephemeral. They would have to go extinct. Even as if they are resilient, small populations would have to go extinct relatively quickly, just even for stochastic reasons. If you have high mortality, most people not living to be in their early 30s, for instance, you have to have a high fertility rate in order to sustain that. If you don't have a high fertility rate, if you for some reason miss that, your population can crash if it's a small population. So when we think about Neanderthals and we think about these archaic human populations, I think we don't want to think, just as John said, we don't want to think about an empire. I think about these tiny little populations that are dying all the time, that are going extinct, with genetic lineages that are going extinct all the time. So I don't know that we can actually apply the kind of model that we apply to humans now in the past. So this all affects population persistence. And by and large, in terms of Neanderthals, I would think that many Neanderthal populations would be very small and very ephemeral. So going back to this, right? This is what's so amazing, right? So this guy's parents, each one of them shares 3%. I have 3. They represent 3% of my ancestry, and I could go to 23andMe, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if I got something back that said, you have 3% Neanderthal ancestry. And I really do know that he's probably not a Neanderthal, right? And that I don't have a Neanderthal 4 generations back in my ancestry. So what does this mean, right? It means that I have lots and lots and lots of Neanderthal ancestors, right? And that we all do, as John was sort of saying. There was lots of interbreeding in the past. There wasn't just a few isolated encounters with Neanderthals and modern humans or other groups. That these were things, this was a pattern. This is something that would have happened over and over and over again at different times and at different places in human prehistory. That there was a lot of interbreeding when these folks came into contact with each other. The Neanderthal mother and the Denisovan father of Denisova 11 that John was talking about, that's the so-called hybrid, right? I'm sure she didn't think of her parents as members of different species. I'm sure that they thought they had much more in common with each other than either did with what we're calling Denisovans or what we're calling Neanderthals. So what you really have, the fact that we have potentially 2 or 3% Neanderthal ancestry is huge. It's a big thing. That's not a little thing. It's something that reflects a pattern of interbreeding, at least among some people in the past. But the big thing is that it wouldn't happen all the time, obviously, and there were long periods of time when folks were not really coming into contact with one another, and there was just a lot of inbreeding within those populations. So there's lots and lots of questions about how we understand relationships between archaic populations, and John has been talking a lot this morning about ways that we can think about those. Although I always feel like trees should be a hypothesis, and we shouldn't necessarily always be using them. Small populations and small total population size, big ways that we differ from people today. We are very, very different from our ancestors. They had lots fewer contacts, much higher mortality, they were more ephemeral, and yet Neanderthal and Denisovan and ghost populations, and probably many ghost populations, will have genes that are remarkably widespread. And we can think about whether networks rather than trees, and when networks rather than trees might be more appropriate to model those relationships. And that can be maybe our lesson from race. And maybe we won't miss the forest for the trees. Thanks.